I am Dr. Wright Voss. I have spent about a decade working in research for worker well-being at Harvard Center for Work Health and Wellbeing is where I was most recently. And before that, I was faculty directing workforce development programming that was funded by the CDC and Health and Resources Services Administration. So I recently moved toward bringing these ideas more into industry. So I'm advising an online well-being platform, and then I love here at Harvard Extension teaching future leaders about worker well-being. And when I get to teach students this topic of science of happiness, one of the first things we ask is like, why? Why would you even take a class like this in a business program? And I think some of the good answers to that is that it's going to relate to your well-being as a leader, but it also relates to the worker well-being of the people that you're going to oversee. And then in order for there to be an organizational culture shift, there needs to be leadership buy-in. So I love the idea of bringing these ideas to the future leaders in business. So one of the things, though, that with the science of happiness, this is a sort of a hands-on experiential topic. So you can't really teach happiness without practicing and experiencing it a little bit. So for graduate students in the management and organizational psychology programs, we start with the idea that it needs to resonate on a personal level. I try to make every student think of themselves as the chief happiness officer first for their own life, but then for the organization that they may be overseeing. So as you think about your own happiness, I think most of America is not doing too well. We see general happiness scores really failing. And maybe it's because we're trying to do happiness maybe the same way we would do email. So we try to do it faster, harder, more efficiently, something like that. It's generally not working. And that's probably because we just as a culture are doing it wrong. Because happiness isn't really like a problem with mood. It's more about how we run our system. It's more of a systems issue. And so if we figure that out, we can maybe make some changes. So in the class, we ask, what does it mean to intentionally build happiness and well-being? And then what does the science of happiness teach us about it? There's tons of books out there that have self-help information. Maybe some of you have read some of those. And that generally doesn't seem to be helping anyone based on happiness scores, both nationally and globally. So in this course, we're going to actually move into building capacity for happiness, figuring out what works for building happiness, and then build capacity just like you would learn any other skill in business, like a leadership skill or something like that. And then we study it with a little more systematically, where we treat it as like a strategy device. What are the drivers of happiness? What are the trade-offs to happiness? What are system resets and levers that we can use to try to build happiness? And we try to build those tools for individuals. The second question I ask after why do we even talk about happiness is who cares? What's the point? Why would this matter besides beyond my own happiness? And the US government, at least, has been investing in this topic, particularly in the area of worker well-being. So they have these total worker health centers. The one at Harvard that I was recently researching for is one of them. It's the Center for Work Health and Well-being. It started in 2011. And so they're realizing that employee engagement's going down, employees aren't doing as well in terms of their mental health. And so they're trying to invest in what can we do to do better. And so some of that research is what I bring adding into the general happiness research in this course since it's in the management program. And then the World Health Organization, as well as the US Surgeon General, have been issuing reports just within the last 3 to 4 years since COVID that really highlight how worker well-being has been flagging. And this is something that a lot of big global organizations care about. So it's a good thing to bring into our business programs. But as we think about why we're not being happy as a society, one of the interesting places to start is with happiness myths, how we get it wrong. So we start with the science, and the one thing science shows us is that we are terrible at predicting what will make us happy. In that, not being very good at this, we overinvest in things that are visible wins that just are checking the box and think are going to make us happy. And then we underinvest in some of the invisible foundations of happiness. And so we'll talk through what some of those are. But here's some of the visible things that people think are going to make them happy that kind of don't. People think I'll be happy when I'm rich, when I'm successful, when or if I fall in love, if I have the perfect body or health, or when X thing happens to me that's going to make me happy. Those tend to be, according to Lubomirski, who's one of the top happiness researchers, and she's written several books. Those are the things she says are the five big myths of what people think will make them happy. And so as you think about those little categories, see if you've ever fallen into any of those traps of have any of those myths ever been a thing that you were hanging your hat on that you'd be happy when it happened? Some of these little micro stories where we head for happiness in the wrong direction is thinking of the high achievers that really succeed themselves in their jobs into burnout. And that's because the systems they build for performance haven't built in any meaning and don't have space for recovery. And so they're achieving at work, but instead of happy, they end up burned out. Think maybe about another group, the savers who save up and buy their dream house. That's the thing they really wanted. But then maybe they end up working such long hours just to pay the mortgage that they're barely even living there. So the thing they thought was going to bring them a lot of joy ends up not improving well-being that overall. Another little micro story that maybe would resonate is socially people who are appeasers and just say yes to everything just to go along to get along. But then they end up doing things they never wanted to do, living a life they maybe never really wanted to live. So there's lots of ways that people enact, engage in behaviors that they think they're doing them to create happiness, and it just doesn't pan out for them. I'm going to give you just one example of some of the research that culminates around one of these topics. The first one, that I'll be happy when I'm rich. So here's just a little bit of the research on that. The You may have heard this before, the idea that income either does or doesn't bring happiness. It brings happiness up to a point, is what the research says, but it plateaus and it starts to have diminishing returns in terms of how much increased income continues to improve happiness. The numbers on that, it generally in the US, when they did some research back in 2010, they did a really good analysis and it was about $75,000 a year. So if you bump that up to today's dollars, that's a little bit more like 90,000 a year. That's the point at which you really see a flattening of the curve. Up to that point, you're getting a lot more well-being boost out of increased income. And then it really starts to flatten at that point where you're getting very minimal increase improvement in well-being as you earn more. And one of the reasons is what's called this Easterlin paradox. Again, this has been hotly debated in the research, but this seems to be the best evidence right now. This chart right here shows how they have tracked low to high income earners in a bunch of different countries. And the principle behind this, what you find is that the richer individuals in any given country tend to have better life satisfaction scores, but that doesn't compare across countries. So you look at the US, we're the blue line up in the top quadrant to the right, and you can definitely see that there's about a 1 point satisfaction difference between the low income earners and the high income earners. So people who earn more are a little bit happier. But look over at Mexico and Brazil, they're just right hanging in there with us. And their incomes generally are much, much lower. So, how can their general life satisfaction scores be on par with the US? And what you tend to see is people compare themselves to others within their known social groups. And that's the biggest impact on happiness. And so it's not absolute value of what you have, it's more the comparison to where you're at. If that's the case, that means we have a lot of control over how happy we feel if we can affect some of those social comparison indicators and other things that we might have some control over. Income on its own, not making us happy. If we are banking our happiness on that and that we'll get more money and we'll feel better, that's not going to tend to work for people. As we apply some of those myths to the workplace, you ask people what's going to be a deal breaker if you're looking for a new job, and financial compensation is right there at the top. Just to relate this, I said that $90,000 a year is the break point on that curve at which you get the really diminishing returns as your income goes up from there. The median salary in the US right now for full-time workers is 68,000. So there's a lot of people who are performing below that where a little more salary is really going to make a difference. It makes sense. That's the number one deal breaker for people. But I think it's really encouraging here that you see work-life balance is right below that. So people recognize that the job is more than a paycheck and that we're not willing to be slaves to our work. So that's a good thing, right? Thinking though about how much stock do we put in our salary for getting satisfaction out of our job. My husband just recently got to ride on a private jet for the first time. He thought it was a blast. He had been invited by an associate to travel to Dallas with him, and he just asked this guy who's a venture capital fund owner about how he does work-life balance. And this gentleman who's very busy in the executive world quoted something that Mitt Romney supposedly said, who was a former Massachusetts governor and was also involved in lots of venture capital wealth firms. I think Bain Capital was the one he ran. And he said, supposedly, that if my family, my work, my friends, my health, and my religion, if I'm failing in all of those quadrants equally, then I'm doing it right, was this supposedly was Mitt Romney's response. So that, I just think about that as your definition of doing things well is that you're so busy, you're being pulled in every direction, and everyone's unhappy with you because they're not getting enough of you. That's a weird kind of balance, right? To be like, imagine you're the mat of a trampoline, those springs pulling you out in every direction. So that goal-driven success treadmill idea of what we view as success, definitely, I think we can understand is not going to bring us happiness. So a course like ours, we have to teach the science to get past some of these myths, and then we have to somehow integrate it. And so to do that, in our classes, we will start with integrate some activities. Like we'll do a mindfulness opener. We'll close with a calming reset activity. We have students do gratitude journals. We have them do other kinds of homework assignments. But a few of the activities we try to bring right into the class to integrate what this feels like. And so as we're thinking about what work can be and whether or not we're getting pulled into this success treadmill or not, I want to practice a visualization together. So let's just take a minute to look inward and explore what our current or past work lives actually feel like. So I want to explore this not in words like busy or productive, but I want you to try to move towards sensations and images, maybe metaphors. So maybe close your eyes for just a moment and think about your recent work experiences and maybe, and if you're a student, you can think of either a past work experience or just you can think of your student life as work and what that's like for you. And in a typical week or season of your professional life, think about the people that you're around on a day-to-day basis, the projects, the coming and going, the deadlines, the milestones. Think of any of those pressures that come up from work and try to think of all the good and the bad and just visualize what is that like for you? You're in the middle of a busy day. What does it feel like? And then, if you're getting a sense of what your work experience is like, now I want you to try to translate those feelings, the experience into some kind of image. So, what would be a good metaphor to capture your work experience? So, if your work life were an image, if it were a scene, if it were an object, what would it be? So, I'm going to give you a couple of examples. And then, if you can think of one for you, I want you to type it into a chat. So would it feel like a tidal wave crashing over you? Or maybe what work feels like for you is more like a garden that you're tending, but they're keeping these weeds cropping up and but you're out there every day weeding them and making things grow. That might be another one. Some others I've heard are feeling like you're on a dartboard with darts flying at you and you're just constantly dodging. Maybe it's a marathon or a maze or a tightrope. Those are some other visualizations. So if you've had anything come to mind, let's give it a few seconds and see if you can type something into the chat that describes what it's like for you. Yeah. So we had the old school telephone switchboard on here. Oh, a doormat. Oh, speed checks. That's a fun one. Lightning bolts. The whole city burning down, and you only have a garden hose to spray it off. We have a marathon on here trying to get to that finish line. Drowning. Oh, that's an overrun feeling. Hopefully that doesn't last for too long because that is a little bit unsustainable. You quickly get to burnout in that sort of scenario. Part of what our goal is to take whatever this kind of image is that we're experiencing and try to transform it to an experience of thriving. We try to do that in our life and we try to do that in work and try to find what are the ways that we can create more of that feeling of thriving, either from work or from our lives in general. So, is this something that is sellable to organizations to focus on happiness? And this JP Morgan research shows that companies that score higher on some of these factors of worker well-being, they call them the human capital factors, had about 7% higher annual average returns. So some of these factors, this chart's tiny, I know, but it's emotional connection at work, having good managers, having autonomy and engagement and empowerment, or things like having shared values with your organization or having a mission-driven purpose. So those are some of the things. Now, I don't think anyone would say this is causal. We can't say that the companies created these positive work experience environments and then that made the workers happy and then that made them have these higher productivity average annual returns. But they are at least correlated, they're related to each other. So there's something about organizations that are successful that workers are thriving. And so that's important to keep in mind. So, as this chief happiness officer pitch, we can say that thriving organizations have thriving workers. And so we want to see what we can do to create that in our organization. One of the, I'll ask students like, why are we studying happiness here in a Harvard business class rather than at an ashram or a temple? And the reason is because we talk about the science of happiness. And so we do keep this really grounded in the science. And so I want to share with you some more of the science. I told you about the how income doesn't necessarily build happiness. That's something we get from the science. But here's we're going to the basics that when you talk about happiness, there's actually like three different ways of talking about it, three different experiences we have that kind of all get lumped together as happiness. And they fall into the hedonic bucket, which is all the things that create pleasure. There's the eudaimonic bucket, which is all the things that create meaning, contentment, enjoyment in that regard. That's a little bit deeper. And then there's the evaluative, where that's where you're rating life satisfaction and how good do I feel looking back over my experiences. Those are three different major buckets of happiness that people experience. And you'll notice those top two are a little bit more feeling based. And then the third one's a little bit more cognitive, where you're thinking back. One of the things that I'll mention, we just talked about income and what does that do to your happiness. What's interesting is that income has a bigger impact on that satisfaction happiness score, the evaluative one, the cognitive one. And it has even, like we already said, it's a mediocre impact. It has that law of diminishing returns after you get to a certain point, but it actually has even less impact on your day-to-day pleasure and eudaimonia or that contentment, meaning-based feeling. So it's interesting that it really more impacts how we think about our well-being versus what we're actually feeling on a day-to-day basis. And that kind of fits with that social comparison theory. The way that income makes me feel good is when I compare myself to the other people around me, to the environment that I'm in, which I think deflates the value of income even more if it's not actually helping me feel better on a day-to-day basis and puts some more weight into those other buckets is what we should be focusing on for happiness. So I want to dive into just a teeny bit like how you get happiness out of those first two buckets. And this goes into the neuroscience just a little, and we go into more of this in the class. But the pleasure hedonic bucket of happiness tends to act on our dopamine system. And the eudaimonic bucket, where you feel a lot more contentment, tends to operate more in the serotonin and oxytocin neurotransmitters. And so there's a few things that are important about these differences. Since pleasure pathways are mediated by dopamine, there are a lot of things that feel really good to boost dopamine. That I'm sure good number that are on the list. Eating good food, a massage, wonderful things, sex or other really positive experiences in life, but also the drugs of abuse can be on that list. And something to know, part of why we talk about the hedonic treadmill is that chasing happiness through dopamine isn't really a good long-term strategy because dopamine is excitatory. It's an excitatory neurotransmitter. And when those neurons are overstimulated, they will die. And that process starts to create addiction. And so that's why you need more and more of whatever the substance is that you're seeking your pleasure from. And so just think for a minute, what are some of the things that you're just slightly addicted to? So for most of us, we get a little sucked into our phones and spend a little too much time scrolling. Maybe it's Netflix or YouTube or something that you're watching. It could be something that feels a little bit positive, like email and clean out your inbox. It could be food, but there's a lot of little things that give us those hits of dopamine and that we maybe jump to a little too quickly when we're wanting to feel a little bit better. And that's where I start off by saying we sometimes work on these visible little boosts in happiness and we underemphasize the things that are the foundations that are a little more meaningful. The second thing to know about this dopamine pathway is that it actually inhibits the serotonin pathways. So when you have and when you go again and again to the dopamine bucket, to the pleasure bucket for boosting your well-being, you're going to start to deplete the serotonin pathway. But the serotonin pathway, it's more long-lived. And so when we put time and effort into those pathways for meaning and happiness, we end up with something that lasts quite a bit longer and we get off that treadmill. Some of those things are going to be things that are relationship based, things that have meaning and mission behind them, where we feel like we're building something, we're being creative, we're helping. And so these two can balance each other. We definitely need some of the pleasure, especially dopamine builds motivation. And so you need some of those positive experiences to get you to complete and work on the deeper sources of meaning and joy, but they definitely have to be in balance. We bring in a lot of experts on happiness in the course. And so Arthur Brooks is one of those. And he has this great, he's got these office hours. If you haven't seen it, I invite you to check it out. Lots of good information there. He's written a number of books, but he's got this great way of talking about those three happiness buckets that I think makes them a little bit relatable that I want to share. In his book titled Build the Life You Want, that's there in the middle, he talks about building happiness with the metaphor of eating a turkey dinner. So I'm going to read to you just a little bit of what he tells us, and I'll let you look at a turkey dinner while we're hearing what he has to say about this. So this is from Arthur Brooks. Each of the domains of happiness is like a macronutrient, pleasure, satisfaction, and meaning, and each of these have residual feelings. And the trick, he says, is don't confuse the feeling with the substance of what creates that real thing. So because happiness is not a feeling, the feelings are just limbic system markers for what is the real thing, the happiness. So he says, think of it like food. Food has protein, carbohydrates, and fat. And those are the actual nutrients of the food of your turkey dinner. But they create feelings like smell and taste that are reminders of those good things. So to have lasting happiness, you need the substance that's going to fuel the enjoyment, satisfaction, and meaning. So he gives this example. If you've ever wondered why watching a sporting event or a concert at home instead of or versus in a crowd of fans is less exhilarating, it's because the game or concert isn't what actually creates the enjoyment. Watching on TV is like having just the smell of the turkey without actually having the turkey nutrients that fill your stomach. It's missing something that turns it from pleasure to meaningful enjoyment. So if you think about all the things that could bring pleasure, food, sex, work goals, relaxing experiences, one way to know if they're giving you a great life is to ask yourself if you're doing them alone for your soul gratification or doing them with others for a meaningful purpose. So that's from Arthur Brooks, making sense out of how do we understand happiness and how do we figure out the things that are going to build happiness for us. Some of the other research on happiness, this is the PERMA model that's really well researched, and it says that the things that bring lasting happiness and joy center around either positive emotion, engagement, relationships, meaning, or accomplishment. So positive emotion looks like just that pleasure bucket, the dopamine aspect. But when you look at what actually goes into positive emotion, it's a little bit deeper. It has the joy, contentment, gratitude. There's these other components to it. So it's a little bit more, it's a little bit deeper than just pleasure. And there's some great things that we learn about how you can build positive emotion and how we need that. And there's really simple things we can do. So if we want to build positive emotion, thinking about the past, we can cultivate gratitude. Forgiveness is another good one. If we want to build it in the present, we can do savoring and mindfulness activities. And then about the future, we do some reframing so that we can build hope and optimism. And there's a lot of skills that we teach students. So this is a quick list and some research on some savoring skills, just to laugh and to giggle, to look for someone to share your experience with, to talk to someone about what you're experiencing. There's just lots of great ways in the moment to savor, and then as you're reflecting back to spend more time savoring. These are great skills, great intentional strategies. And back to Sonia Lubomirski, she says, the more you savor the good in your life, the less likely you take it for granted, and the more likely you will be to be happy. So these savoring skills are great. There's this comedian that I saw that just, he was talking about how stupid it feels that your brain can be tricked into happiness. That all it takes is like this gratitude journal or a little bit of self-talk about how good things are, and your brain is, yeah, I'll buy that. It feels stupid, it feels simple, but that's why we have to practice it in class because it actually really does work. And so we need to give people the experience. So that's the happiness class. And then we're just getting ready to launch a new one that builds a little bit more on an experience that's tied to happiness and to well-being, but isn't really connected with any one of these pillars. The experience of awe is something we're finding the research really connected to good health and well-being. And it doesn't fit into any one of these pillar categories. It's a little bit positive emotion, it's a little bit engagement, a little bit meaning. It's something different. So we've got some new research around awe that it's just this different physiological experience. It's associated with elevated vagal tone, reduced sympathetic arousal, increased oxytocin, reduced inflammation. And these are all aspects of physiological function that are really connected to mental and physical well-being. So awe looks really promising. So we're going to do a new class on this. And it's partly because awe creates these really cool outcomes. So it expands perceptual and cognitive frames. So you see things in a broader way. It creates what they label as epistemic humility. So you feel small in the presence of whatever it is that you're being inspired by. And that seems to be the foundation for curiosity. And so think about how important curiosity is in so much of what we do. It enhances openness to experience and cognitive flexibility. So if you're trying to get into creativity, thinking outside the box, these awe experiences can bring you there. It shifts your attention away from a self-internal focus to an external focus, which expands your ability to see ideas and to see what's possible. And then through all those things seems to be strengthening internal motivation to learn. And it's the opposite of crawling into a hole and hiding from life experience. It's opening you up to what's capable of being out there. This is a new area of research that we're jumping into, and it hasn't been approved yet, but hoping to bring that class this next year as well. So those are the fun classes I teach. And with that, I think I have a picture of puppies to make us happy.
Wow, thank you so much. I am so sad. I am going to be graduating soon. There's always more classes to take. Maybe I'll come back as a non-credit student because that's incredible. Thank you so much for your time. I want to open it up for questions. Does anyone have any? Feel free to raise your hand. Trying to look at the participants, see if anyone's got their hand raised. Lindsay.
Yeah, thank you. This was really interesting. It wasn't what I don't know what I thought it was going to be, but it wasn't what I thought it was going to be. So thank you. I am curious to know in the class, do you look at these are the things that are helpful, or do you practice applying those? Or, and I see that it's a management, I'm in the management field. So this,
Yeah.
I already have planned out what I was going to do. This wasn't on my list. And I'm like, Is there a way to make it fit? I'm just
Right,
curious to
right.
know, like, how do you apply that to managers?
Yeah, so
How
one
do
of
you
our
apply
four
it?
units, after we build on the science of what happiness is and how it works, is the how do you apply this in the workplace? And two of the big projects that I have for the class, because I teach it in management, focus on the applications to the workplace. So one is a team project where you're a chief happiness officer for a company and you propose a strategy based on all the things we've talked about that might improve happiness for workers. And then I have students create their happiness portfolio. And so we like treat it as if it's like an investment portfolio. What are the things you're going to invest in to build happiness? And we have those opportunities to try to see how it can fit into a more of a management perspective versus just the personal perspective. But before that, we've built on really the science that's out there. So you have to know how to measure well-being first. And so that's a whole scientific process and category that we go into. And it applies to all the other things that people are difficult constructs to measure. So that's going to be relevant to other areas of people's jobs and careers, but figuring out how you measure something that's squishy and measure it so that you can measure outcomes and returns is part of what we do. And then we go through PERMA model I use as a foundation. So we spend classes on the positive emotion piece, the engagement piece, the relationships piece, the meaning piece, and the accomplishment piece. And we go through all the research in those areas as well. And we can't practice it very much in the class. So we bring in just a few little experiences, visualizations, and breathing activities and other things to try it out. And the rest is all in assignments. And so students have the daily or weekly happiness practices that they get to select from the list of options and they write reflections on those so that you can hopefully practice some of them as well. So that's how we bring it all in, try to keep it management focused, but also practicing through our own personal experience in order to figure out how to make it work. In my worker well-being class, we focus a little bit more on the actual programs that you can bring into the workplace in order to improve worker well-being. Yeah, Haley.
So it's a question about reverting back to one's old ways. So I work in the digital health department for government. And so one of the main initiatives was for transitioning all fax documentations. Clinicians were faxing in documentation to get access to digital systems. And there was initiative to reduce that, well, actually eliminate faxing altogether. However, they're still faxing things in, and the initiative was to reduce like administrative burden on them. However, they still reverted back to their old ways because I guess in theory they're accustomed to it, and taking time to learn something new while they already have so much responsibility adds a little bit more burden. But the initiative was supposed to help them feel better and
Right.
reduce burden. So I'm wondering if you can speak on why individuals revert back to old ways in which aren't creating positive environments for them.
Certainly, that's the dopamine pathways that we explored just a little bit explains some of that because people do need to feel good in the moment. And so they're going to go to those things that are going to either alleviate stress in the moment or make them feel better in the moment. And the certainty of a system I already have in place is certainly much more comfortable than the uncertainty. It's part of why I want to explore the awe channel a little bit more, is because if you can build some comfort around those learning experiences, those places where you feel small and like you don't have all the pieces together, if we can build some resilience around those kind of things, maybe it'll help people to be a little more empowered when they get to those, oh, I have to do something new, but I know it's going to be good in the end. And can I stick with it? Resilience kind of components. So it makes sense that people revert back. One of the things that comes to mind for me as you mentioned that is how much were the frontline workers involved in planning that shift? Just even if maybe the idea came from frontline workers, I don't know, but if they're involved along the way, saying what their challenges are, that's one of the things we learn in the worker well-being literature is that so often worker well-being programs are brought in and imposed from the top down rather than really addressing what the workers say are their needs. And one of the approaches now that's more of a bottom-up systems approach is like worker well-being committees or councils where it could just be that the music's too loud on the shop floor, or it could be where the garbage cans are placed. But you hear from workers what are the things that interrupt their well being. and you find what can we do as a system, as an organization to fix those things our workers care about. And that really empowers workers. And then you find that some of those things they stick because the workers cared about them. So that's one other response I have to like how do you get the buy-in so that people can follow through and dealing with the things they care about is one of the responses to that.
Thanks so much actually for that initiative. There was millions put into it, and it was actually from the workers and iterations of consulting, help first
Mhm.
line providers, and just the adaptation alone. No one was anticipating that they wouldn't adapt or change their ways. So I was just very surprised by that because government has been engaging with leadership within our health authority and so forth for that. And it's disappointing because there was so much put into that. And so now they're in a place that how do we go about it? Maybe engaging them again to see why, and maybe that's the best approach.
Obviously, the incentives weren't right because if they were, people would do the things that they're incentivized to do. And so you can go back to some other change, whether it was a little more training, giving them a little more time, whatever, it was anything that shifts the incentives would potentially maybe get them to engage in that behavior, retain that new process, or maybe our initial analysis was flawed and that wasn't actually a high priority item, even if it came from the workers. So yeah, it could be either one of those, and you would just have to go back and ask the questions and see if we can figure it out. I will just mention one other quick thing. I was trying to figure out what were the things that would help older workers stay in the workforce longer with some research. And I wanted to ask them what they preferred at work, what their needs were at work, and compare that to the actual working conditions they had and see if there was a mismatch. Finding out what people prefer is really difficult as a measurement task. That's part of why we go into the science of measurement. It's really hard for people to know what they care about. And so we use some tricks, like we have people rank order things. You'll put 10 things on the list and put the highest one at the top. And so that little bit of comparison, one to the other, helps people figure out what do I care about more. Sometimes we just pit some against each other if it's this or that, and that can help people get a little bit more clarity versus a list of 7 to 10. Sometimes they'll do whole stories, and these seem to work the best where you'll say, who's in this position, and what would you do if you were in the same shoes? But it's really hard and it's not very reliable overall because mostly people don't know what they prefer until they're actually in that situation. I'll give you one other quick example. My daughter gets to work on this cool legal case, the one that's out, the social media case that's in LA right now, challenging the social media companies that they've been addicting teenagers with their algorithms. And it's a huge workload to be on this case. And so she thought she was working on it and had plans to go and have the 2 months where she'd have to travel to LA. And then she got this email saying, "Oh, so we know that you're not really going to be needed on this, and thanks for all your contributions, and we'll touch base. You're not going to have to go down to LA." And she thought she'd been dreading the work. And when she got that email, she realized, oh my gosh, why don't I get to do it? Like she ended up realizing how invested and excited she was about the opportunity and the project. But she didn't know that up front when she was dreading the big assignment that was coming up. It wasn't until she was put into this other circumstance. So it's just really hard for people to know their preferences. And it's something to keep in mind as we're trying to figure out what's going to work, what needs to change, is that what people tell you may not actually be the thing that's most important and that needs to happen.
That's so interesting. I'm curious to see how are these studies coming along when it comes to neurodivergent people in the workforce.
I haven't dove into that very much. Certainly, the neurodivergence is one of the value adds that's coming out of that way of thinking about people is that you just see everyone's on a spectrum, right? There isn't really a break point where this group is different. And so we've had this allowing for accommodations model that treats some groups as different and needing special things. And it's really going to be better at some point when we all just recognize that everyone has different ways of doing things, different strengths, different weaknesses, different insights. So I think that's one of the value adds of the neurodivergent conversations. I do throw cases at students in my work well-being course about this company has promoted this neurodivergent leader, and then these are the kind of struggles that are coming up, and what do we do, and how do we manage that? So we talk about it, but I haven't dove into that literature, so I can't really speak too much to that.
Like you were talking about moving trash cans and things like that. One of the things that I've learned as I'm actually going through my house and making it more ADHD friendly is making sure things are at point of performance. So
Yeah.
I'm not going and crossing across my kitchen to get a cup of tea. Like my teacups are there, my water's there, my kettle's there, all within arm's reach so you can get the whole task done. And I'm interested in seeing what that overlap is. But
And that's one of those beautiful lessons that comes as we think about how are we going to make the workplace more accommodating for whether it's ADA compliance or whatever the needs of this individual are. We actually get to update the whole system so it's better for everyone. That's a wonderful outcome of that.
I think it's cool that happiness is measurable. Anyway,
Yeah.
any more questions?
Thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Voss. It was very informative and interesting. Thank you.
You bet.
Yeah, this is
Thank you.
awesome. I'm excited to get this uploaded so we can make sure that you have a full class stack during summer and fall. And I appreciate you reaching out to us and collaborating with us. This has been incredible. I've learned a lot, even just in this micro presentation.
I've just been teaching at Extension School for a year now, and this a really high caliber students. It's been a really fun, every class is just a joy to interact with the students. It's a pleasure, and I love doing it.